of the Palestinian people and questions of apartheid. He is now, of course, emerited from Princeton University, and he is a distinguished visiting fellow of the Institute of State Crime, Queen's Mary University, London. He has contributed a lot to present conflict areas, especially in the Middle East, and has worked as well on kind of an assessment of the intervention and legitimacy of wars, the issue of the Vietnam War and power shifts in the No Global Order, which came out as a book in London in 2016. And he is now editing in another book about exploring emergent global thresholds. I think this kind of discussion and lecture which we have, which we expect today, doesn't come unexpected. Because as you all know, we are from Germany mostly, since 2015, when our former German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier piercingly stated, "Die Welt ist aus den Fugen," the world is in disarray. This view is basically now shared in most countries in East and West. In other words, we are living in a transitional period which lacks stability and security. The unipolar world order under the hegemonic assertiveness of the United States give way to a multipolar order. And this new order has neither a broad socio-political consensus nor universally accepted norms, and even more problematic, it is not based on established institutions. So it comes to a surprise to me at least, and maybe to others as well, that despite the situation which we have in the international scenery, and it's very clear, and you all know this, it's that the main drivers for change in the international scenery are China, the United States, to a certain degree Russia, and to a very small degree the European Union. But even given the challenges and the problems we are facing in Europe, in the European Union, it comes really as a surprise that within this year, 2018, within 8 months, basically across the political lines of parties, from the Greens to the Christian Social Democrats and the Social Democrats, we have started a debate what kind of order we are achieving or we are going to reach. And it is quite interesting that, for example, Joschka Fischer, our former foreign minister, and Jürgen Trittin contributed to this discussion, and as well Gernot Erler, the former coordinator for the relationship between the Russian and the German civil society, and all came out with very similar prescriptions and definitions of the situation in Europe. Basically, it is a kind of the West is at the end, the West is dead, as Trittin very bluntly stated. And even Gernot Erler from the Social Democratic Party sees the West not as a structuring element in the emerging New World Order. So it is very interesting to know what is the position, of course, of the United States. And here we have seen changes. We have seen a kind of a attitude towards NATO and towards the European Union, which was not expected, which basically undermines the long shared principles within the transatlantic community. And I'm very, very grateful that Richard Falk is going to address the issues, what may be the position of the Trump administration in the next years. How do they see the world emerging? And of course, we have had on the 6th of November elections, midterm elections in the United States, or maybe he can give his personal view as well, how he sees the relevance or the irrelevance of these kind of elections in order to change or to alter the course of the Trump administration. And within our own, to do our own advertisement, we just published with Campus a book, Multipolarity, which is the second one in the project. The first one came out last year, which is called Core Europe and Greater Eurasia. And this is called Multipolarity, the Promise of Disharmony. Richard. Will you please talk to us?
I have little choice. Let me first say how glad I am to be here, and is that on?
Yes, it should.
Oh, good. I'm very happy to be here, and I thank Peter for the invitation and the Dialogue of Civilizations, which I've previously had contact with through their meetings on the island of Rhodes. Peter gave me a very difficult assignment because anyone that tries to interpret our president, Donald Trump, has to be as crazy as Trump, because his defining feature is to be radically unpredictable. And even the people that are most closely associated with the presidency have no idea each day what new deviation from the previous day that he will take. He's a master at commanding what they call the news cycle, and somehow keeping the light of media attention focused on him, whatever the concern may be. So I think it's important to be very humble in trying to either talk about what Trump represents or what I call Trumpism how that is evolving in a dependent and independent way, and also how to think about these midterm election results. I was reminded of Zhou Enlai's response to André Malraux when he asked him what he thought of the French Revolution, and Zhou Enlai replied, "It's too early to tell." And that's dramatically true with respect to these American elections. It can be looked upon by both the Republican side and the Democratic side as mildly favorable to either of them. The Democrats won the popular vote by a margin of 7% nationally, which is a significant beacon of Trump's unpopularity with the citizenry as a whole, and does give the Democrats a somewhat hopeful prospect in 2020, the next presidential election, if they can themselves produce a candidate that represents both their kind of establishment orientation, the parties, and the young people and the women that were responsible for the degree to which the Democrats did do well in this midterm election. And that's one thing to look at. It was an unprecedented increase in youth and women participation, and 100 women were elected to the House of Representatives, which again is very unusual. It's not more than unusual, it never happened before. And it included women that you would have to say were countercultural, that openly were gay or openly transgender, from minority groups, including a Muslim. I believe 2 Muslim women were elected. This is really, in the era of Trump, a kind of contradiction almost, to see that and one way of thinking about what is happening in America is that the center cannot hold. In other words, the political energies are going to the two extremes of American political life. And the left extreme is very disorganized compared to the collapse kind of cultural left rather than an ideological left. Has to do with the repudiation of racism, sexism, mistreatment of undocumented immigrants. It concerns a whole range of issues that aren't connected with, for instance, the traditional socialist agenda. And an important aspect of, I think, the whole context is that there has been an imbalance in American politics, and I think more generally in the politics of the West, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because capitalism, in my view, needs whether you call it socialist or something else, alternative to keep it humane. Otherwise, that are very cruel to those that are not successful in the marketplace. And you have this problems associated with intent or in mind that there has been no recovery of a progressive political alternative, which has given all the political energy to the right wing. And this is not only an American phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. And one has this very unusual development of democratically elected autocrats. I would put Trump in that category, but also I would put the leader of the Philippines, Duterte, Bolsonaro, the right-wing figure that was just elected in Brazil, Modi in India. They call him our Trump, and the list is unfortunately quite long, and it creates a new kind of sub-alignment in global politics where these leaders like each other and they support each other, and it is a shift, as Peter was saying in his introductory comments. It's a shift away from the way global politics had been seen ever since the end of World War II, because it's no longer descriptive to just talk about the West or East-West. It may now be the autocrats versus the rest, in some sense, because almost every important country at the moment, with a few exceptions, either governed by one of these democratically elected autocrats or has a surging right-wing opposition that is challenging and pushing the center further and further to the right. See, one of the, in order to not be overtaken by these right-wing political movements. And again, I think in thinking about what to say tonight, one aspect of the situation that occurred to me is that Europe is probably the most challenged dimension of the Trump foreign policy, because elsewhere in the world, except conceivably the effort to renegotiate the economic relationship with China, the ideas of global security that have persisted ever since the end of World War II rested on this pillar of Atlanticism, Western, the NATO alliance, and the notion of Western solidarity, which was centered in both the defense of Europe and the sense that Euro-American interests and values coincided. See, and what Trump has expressed and should be the cause of a certain kind of political shock is he's really rejected that sense of primacy, the primacy of this Euro-American alliance. And it's interesting, in his 2018 talk at the General Assembly, which is a quite revealing text if you want to understand what he thinks his approach to world order is, he singles out 4 countries for praise, and not one of them is European, unless you consider Israel a European country. The 3 others are Poland, well, Poland is European, of course, and Saudi Arabia and India. See, and he thinks those are, he said to all the 192 governments there, these are the 4 shining examples of positive political orientation. And all of them, in my view, have dramatic democratic deficits. None of them can claim to have, except for Israel, none of them do claim democratic credentials. And the other characteristic they have is they all like Trump. See, he picks the 4 countries that he has a love deficit. We have 2 kinds of deficits, the democratic deficit and the love deficit. And his narcissism is partly associated with that feeling that unless he gets positive attention, he seems subject to psychological depression. And there's a book that's been published in the US written by a group of psychiatrists that suggests that he's not mentally fit to be the leader of an important country because of this instability and need for positive affection. Let me just say something a little bit more directly about the midterm elections. A lot depends, I think, on one of 3 scenarios. The most plausible outcome is that it will make very little difference in relation to foreign policy. it may make a significant difference in relation to domestic policy, because Congress can block legislative initiatives at this point that it couldn't do before. But I think the likely outcome is there are three things that could make it much more interesting than it now appears to be. One is the report of the special counsel that is supposed to be investigating the collusion between the Trump presidential campaign in 2016 and the Russian government. And it has other implications, and it could be explosive in either of two ways. One is it could really disclose a pattern of criminality that would challenge the Congress to initiate some kind of impeachment proceeding. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that Trump is aware of this outcome, and he tries to get rid of Mueller, the special counsel, and is upheld in doing that by the new Attorney General, who he dismissed what he thought of as a too fair-minded Attorney General. So he has a person that was opposed to the special counsel having any role at all. So that could really create a challenge and an opportunity for the Democratic control of the House of Representatives, which has the authority to initiate impeachment proceedings, which they did against Bill Clinton back in the 90s. And it could create a kind of constitutional crisis, depending on how Trump deals with it. The second scenario that could make these midterm elections seem quite a bit more important than they now seem is the tactical decision by Trump, on the one hand, whether he wants to tries to adopt a cooperative approach, which he said he wanted to do with the Democrats, and sort of softens the positions he's taken on the very hot-button issues like immigration and health. And that also bears on how the Democrats tactically view their own role. Are they better off trying to create an impression that they are being responsible legislators by working with Trump to the extent that he's trying to cooperate with them, or do they do better by obstructing his program? See, and both sides are looking toward the 2020 presidential election. But depending on how this plays out, it could create either a rather harmonious sequel to these midterm elections, or a much more conflictual sequel. And as I say, it's too soon to tell. And the third possibility is a feeling of entrapment by the Trump presidency and by a feeling of a perception of the decline of American power that would lead toward a diversionary war or initiative, most likely with Iran, as a way of trying to unify the country and fulfill this relationship with Saudi Arabia and Israel to achieve control over the Middle East and to contain or destabilize Iran to the point where the government collapses or is willing to relinquish its own political ambitions. So I think those are the three things to think about in trying to assess whether there is any political consequences that emerge from these midterm elections, which, as I say, both sides are viewing as encouraging from their point of view. The Republicans, because they increased their majority in the Senate, and the Congress, the Democrats, because they took control of the House of Representatives and won the popular vote. The election isn't completely over yet because there's some recounts in key states that could affect psychologically and even arithmetically the ratio of relative power in Congress. Let me say something now about what Trump and Trumpism seem to represent politically. And I think it's important to understand that there are three sort of faces of Trump, or three persona that he possesses. There's Trump, the demagogue, who is surprisingly talented at mobilizing and exciting a dormant, very discontented lower middle class and working class, especially the people that feel they've been displaced by globalization. That's the part of his rhetoric and style that makes people talk about a fascist threat. And that you've never heard that kind of language used in American political discussion previously. And it is the sense that that this kind of mobilized right-wing racist outlook, anti-immigration, ultra-nationalist, is so legitimate that any challenge to it can be resisted and even forcibly rejected. So there is this danger that people feel from this demagogic side of the Trump political persona. And then there's Trump, the ideologue, which people often overlook because he is so unpredictable in his tactical maneuvers. But if you look at the policies that he supports and professes, they all are on the extreme right. There's no inconsistency on the ideological level. And it's extreme form of capitalism. It's a tax reform that is beneficial only to the ultra-rich. It is a hostility to Muslims, to minorities, to Hispanics. It represents, in other words, a coherent understanding of a new right-wing kind of political ideology. And it's not, and as I tried to indicate earlier, it's not, there's no countervailing progressive ideology. And so it is the only game in town, so to speak, when one's thinking ideologically about the present situation. And then there's Trump, the trickster, the third persona, in which he dumps his closest advisors, and he doesn't release his tax returns, and he does a whole series of things that sort of remind one of a very good boxer who bobs and weaves and avoids being directly hit. And he's quite brilliant at that, at avoiding this kind of direct assault. But it's important, in my view, not to treat him as a trivial passing phenomenon. He is consistent with these other kinds of political leaders that are hostile to democratic values and antagonistic to the support of human rights, particularly for journalists and in relation to academic freedom. It's very interesting if you think back to the time here, the historic moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the sense of the world after the Soviet collapse. The overwhelming expectation was the spread of democracy throughout the world, and that did seem to be happening. And now you have this reversal, the de-democratization of political life on the planet. And it's because it's happening in so many places, it's clearly structural in its underpinnings and does reflect in part a reaction, complex reaction that has these national variations to globalization, neoliberal globalization. And if you want to understand the rise of these populist right-wing figures, you have to look at the way in which neoliberal globalization privileged capital at the expense of people. See, and I think that's the kind of fundamental sin, so to speak, of the kind of globalization that became possible only after the collapse of socialism. See, it would not have been possible before. And therefore, in a kind of one of these paradoxes of history, the winning of the Cold War came with this big cost that it basically jeopardized the kind of humanistic capitalism that had emerged under pressure from the labor movement, from organized labor, and from socialism. There are other things than the collapse of Soviet Union, the passing of the industrial, being in a post-industrial phase of the economy is also highly relevant. But the principal observation, I think, is that we've reached a point in global history where the kind of outlook that had been favored by the liberal democracies in Europe and North America is out of fashion. Whether it will come back into fashion is uncertain, but it's certainly at the moment in decline and out of fashion, and that's troubling, I think, for those of us that believe in a more humane form of political life. As far as world order is concerned, let me just make a few quick remarks about that. As I said earlier, the bypassing of Europe as the cornerstone of Western security is probably the most dramatic thing that Trump has done in foreign policy. And it's underappreciated in my view. And one can speculate that he initially thought that he could get away with realigning the world order through a cooperative, hegemonic relationship with Russia. That was the probably original thought, that instead of a Cold War, there would be a cold or a hot peace, and that this would give more leverage in relation to China on the economic front. And because he doesn't care about values and civilizational identities, it was a purely geopolitical realignment that seemed to underlie his original thinking. Why did he abandon it is another important question. And it raises the issue of whether there is functioning in the American political system what some people call the deep state. Did the deep state veto this kind of geopolitical alignment? And so what one has instead of the realignment is a kind of confusion, neither a reaffirmation of the Western alliance structure and the centrality of Europe in the thinking about world order, nor a substitute for that in terms of some new alignment with other powers. You may remember that after the Cold War, what were called in the US the neocons, or the neoconservatives, who were very influential in the George W. Bush presidency, but actually by and large opposed Trump when he was a candidate, and more or less are not influential in the present scheme of things, except possibly the National Security Advisor, John Bolton. But there was, the neocons wanted a shift of the center of world politics from Europe to the Middle East. And this was partly driven by Israeli influence, which was quite great among the neocons, and partly by petropolitics, the sense at that time that oil was the lever of global power, and that was what was important, and that Europe was not as central as it had been in the two world wars, that it was a new global order in that way. As I said, the best image of Trump's world order perspective was given by in his 2018 UN General Assembly speech, where in addition to saying that he had accomplished more in 2 years than any American president before him, that evoked laughter among the delegates, what he laid out was a new extreme version of a world where sovereignty is the highest value, and where he articulated in a fairly consistent way the notion that instead of globalism, one should emphasize patriotism. And by patriotism, he meant do what's best for your own nation and forget about the world. And he likes to say to American audiences, I was elected the American president, not the president of the world. And he says that the only time that peace and prosperity has been achieved is when strong nations defend their own interests. Now, this unfortunately comes at a time when global challenges are at their maximum. In other words, it has never been as inappropriate to question the need for global solutions to global problems. Climate change, global migration, nuclear weapons, there are a whole series, extreme poverty. All these issues cannot be solved through a state-centric, by a state-centric logic. They really require a cooperative approach of the sort that Obama was trying to pursue, but without great success, partly because he didn't have control of the US Congress. But he did try to have these lawmaking treaties with Iran, on climate change, the Global Migration Compact. He was in favor of all that kind of thing. Now, what Trump not only is sovereignty first and America first, but he's also unabashedly hostile to the UN and to the idea of international institutions having independent authority. And he went out of his way to say, we'll only support the UN to the extent that it supports our policies. And he also made the point that we will give foreign aid from now on to those countries that support what we believe in. So it's an effort to create this kind of what's sometimes called transactional approach, where the US looks for how to get the maximum advantage in every context where policy issues are at stake. So from my point of view, and I'll stop here and welcome your questions, the dysfunctional character of Trump's view is based on this rejection of a necessary component of global problem solving, that a state-centric world cannot solve the problems facing humanity, and if they're not solved, they get worse. And so you hand to the future generations, future leaders, a very bad set of cards to play the game of politics with. So it's extremely irresponsible from a historical point of view, but it's an understandable reaction to the way in which neoliberal globalization has played out as far as the lives of ordinary people are concerned in many countries. So it's that tension between democratic values and the dehumanization of capitalism as the foundation of the world economy. Let me stop there and welcome questions. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, questions, but before we give the opportunity to you, I will say hello to our transatlantic neighbors. An institute, a global think tank from Argentina, is linked to us, CARI, and we are as well linked to the Moscow office of the DOC. So, welcome. Sorry for not saying that first, but now we are online. Questions and answers. Yeah, Herr Tannenbaum, please. Oh, you need one?
Jonathan Tannenbaum. Professor Falk, thank you very, very much for your remarks, very thought-provoking. And I couldn't agree more with your remark, central remark about the question of neoliberal policy and the systemic problem. Two questions in connection with that. Why, or it's an anomaly for me, to try to understand why the Democratic Party, let us say Obama himself, but also the New York Times and other institutions associated with what you might call the liberal establishment, why there would seem to be no real self-criticism, or very little. Of course, everything went about how it could have been possible to lose the election, or you could say, well, the Russians did it, but whatever the Russians did, a large part of the US population, some around 50% or 45%, rejected the policies or some policies of the Obama administration. Everybody became hysterical about the Russians, but it would seem exactly on this question of neoliberal, this model, why not reflect on self-critically? Second point, you always put, okay, now, you always put Trump in the middle as if everything were becoming from him. And I want to ask you, if we look at the Republican Party, which has been very much in the shadow of Trump, will it change all that much if, for example, Pence becomes vice president? Or we look at the Republican Party, there was the Tea Party, there was a whole process, very complicated one in the Republican Party. And some of the things that are actually coming out on the end of Trump's policy are not that inconsistent with trends in the Republican Party.
Let's stick to the domestic policies first, if you don't mind.
What should I do?
Either we collect a couple of questions and then you answer. I think this is easy. To this kind of an element of domestic policies in the United States, are there any comments and questions? Ladies first.
Sorry, Catherine Tepper. I also really appreciated the remarks, and sticking to the domestic side, I would be interested to know what you believe the key factors in the Democratic victory in the House were in this election. Like, was it simply a backlash against Trump, or what other factors were key here?
I would like to invite our Moscow office and the Argentinian office as well, if there are questions and comments, short comments, of course. Please go ahead.
My question would be the following. Should Trump's autocratic nationalism of the right become a failure, and in 2020 you have democratic progressives coming to power, wouldn't they be tempted also to become rather authoritarian once they reach the government power? and therefore we may as well say goodbye to liberal democracy, as this seems to be out of fashion.
Let's Metz.
So I have a question. This is the Moscow office. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, we can hear you.
This is the Moscow office. Yes, okay, so thank you very much for your comments and your remarks. You mentioned Trump's remarks about him having achieved more these past 2 years than any other American president before that. My question to you, Professor Falk, do you think he has achieved anything? And if yes, what has he achieved these past 2 years? Thank you.
Yeah, Lutz Metz, Freie Universität. After having read Bob Woodward's book, Fear, I also have in mind that there must be a fourth person of Trump, which Tillerson called moron. You didn't talk about this.
Okay. There must be a fourth person called moron. Okay, go ahead.
Good. I'm grateful for these questions because they raise issues that I had intended to discuss myself, but somehow failed to do so. As this issue of why Obama didn't challenge this way of organizing economic and political life more, and he didn't. He relied on the same sort of Goldman Sachs, Wall Street economists that were relied upon by the Republican administration before him. And the short answer is that the Democratic Party establishment, ever since the Clinton presidency in the 1990s, has been co-opted by Wall Street. And so there is no economic diversity in the, between the two parties. It's, you know, people talked about the bipartisan consensus during the Cold War, in which there was no real difference on how to deal with the Soviet Union and the international conflict. But the Washington consensus that emerged in relation to IMF, World Bank, global economic policy also was bipartisan. And Obama was a big disappointment to those of us that hoped he would address some of these issues in a more direct way. And he didn't even bring in, you know, sort of mildly critical economists like Paul Krugman or Joseph Stiglitz, both of whom were Nobel Prize winners. And he could have at least had some creative tension around these issues. But I think the Washington consensus was just too strong, and he himself may be a victim of it, may be part of it. And the other question about Trump and Trumpism, you know, the phenomenon is, as I tried to say but didn't really talk about, there is a drift to the right politically, and many people thought that one was better off with Trump than Pence because Pence would be more effective in getting his reactionary legislation adopted. And he sort of faded away. It's hard to know what's happened to him. He's disappeared in, at least in the public view. But I think you're absolutely right that the end of Trump does not mean the end of Trumpism. And Trumpism is also internationally present in these other governments in India, Brazil now, Philippines, elsewhere. So it's a much deeper problem than this one individual that has, but this one individual shouldn't be underestimated because of this demagogic side. See, if he's should survive the next presidential election, he would be in a position to really create a very scary kind of political system in the US and influence others as well. As far as the what he has achieved, the questions from our Russian colleagues, I think that can get a very short answer. As far as I can tell, nothing much. I mean, they have passed a tax bill that's very pleasing to what Bernie Sanders calls the 1%, and it's really 1/10 of 1% that gets the benefits. And see, part of the mystery of Trump's persisting popularity with people who've suffered from economic globalization is that while the very rich are getting even richer and are very greedy, the lower 50% or even 60% have endured a long period of stagnant wages and salaries and even decline, so that you have a very lopsided, increasingly unequal society. And the only way you can handle that kind of disparity is by finding scapegoats and extreme solutions that mobilize emotions rather than deal rationally with problems in a humane way. We can take other questions.
To the question of...
There's a question.
Yeah, wait a second. To the question of what has he achieved and what has he been done, didn't he stop the process of offshoring American industries?
I'm not sure. I just don't know enough. I mean, you can say that his Korean diplomacy, even though it was reckless, sort of geopolitical poker, you know, bluffing terrible things happening, led to a kind of hopeful set of responses in which it seems possible that the Korean Peninsula will have not only peace, but will have reunification finally. And he probably deserves some credit for achieving that result, even though his means of doing that could have produced a catastrophic war.
Thank you. In fact, I was just about to raise the Korean issues, but you've dealt with it. Walter Rothschild, I'm actually more theologian than an American political expert. And when I read ancient texts, I see the yearning of people for a king. People want a king, and they want a royal family, and the richer and more splendiferous the palace is, the more the poor people seem to love it. And I'm sort of seeing parallels here. I think, I disagree with you that he's achieved nothing. He's achieved that the word Trumpism exists. You know, I mean, that's an important issue. We're now talking about the Trump era. It's only been there for a couple of years. And what I see is a bully who knows how to get on with other bullies, whether it's in Iran or in Syria or in Palestinians or Korea or wherever else. He just goes and bullies them, and they react positively in a way that they don't with liberals. Now, for myself as a liberal, this is very upsetting. But if one stands back and takes a look at it, this is the big paradox. It works. I wish sometimes it didn't, but it does. So my question, in a sense, is: are we, by focusing very much on internal political issues, internal party issues, and I'm afraid I missed the first part of your talk, I arrived late, but the personality issues, are we perhaps missing a major national psychology issue whereby people all around the world at the moment seem to be looking for a strong man in a grey suit who will bully all their enemies or supposed enemies? And if one can analyze it on that basis, does it all become clearer somehow?
Thank you. Further questions?
Yeah, my name is Elke Fimmen from Executive Intelligence Review. Professor Falk, I was really missing in the composition of your speech, which of course is difficult. You pointed out what are the problems on this topic. But I think considering the fact that we had a war policy and a confrontation policy by the Obama administration against Russia and by Hillary Clinton, the very fact that Trump said from the beginning that it's a good thing to have good relations with Russia, that this alerted what you call the deep state, but it also alerted very clearly the British establishment, because talking about Russiagate, everything which was put into motion right from the beginning, even before Trump was elected, and then going through all these various campaigns and so on, the hysteria after the Helsinki summit, when these questions were put on the table. And, I mean, this is something which I think one should really consider and not just gloat about Trump like being whatever, but now the upcoming meeting with Putin, hopefully in Argentina, other discussions, I think we all can agree that world peace is at stake, and it's good if an American president establishes good relations with Russia. I think for me, the real shock about what has happened in the last 2 years is that there has been ongoing a coup by the Obama security services, including cooperation and collusion with the British, to topple Trump. And that is something which is the biggest scandal whatsoever, and that really troubles me, and that makes, for me, or puts the question, what is the structure of the United States government if something like this can happen? Because there was no Russian collusion, and Mr. Mueller knows this, and there's probably not coming out anything about this now. But the British collusion and the Obama secret services, what they try to destroy the potential for cooperation between Trump and Putin. This is criminal because it's a matter of world peace. And I would really like to introduce this subject into the discussion because we are not talking academically in this matter right now. Thank you.
So we shift now to the international scenery. Michael Hoffen. A question from Moscow?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Falk, for your very insightful opinions. My question is linked to what you said about international organizations. I think that would agree that the distrust that Trump displays towards international organizations goes quite against the theory of hegemonic stability and the role that the United States always traditionally played in many of the international organizations that it was one of the founding fathers of. My question is, do you believe, it's a bit of a provocative one, but do you believe that this distrust and skepticism that he displays towards international organizations opens a window of opportunity for developing countries to finally have fair representation of their interests within international organizations?
Thank you. Michael.
We have a question from Argentina.
Okay, and then please go ahead.
Yes, please. Very briefly. I would like to know what is your view of identity politics, given the new article that was written by Francis Fukuyama in Foreign Affairs, where he, in a certain way, blames identity politics for the breakdown of the democratic consensus. And this is quite an issue in the United States.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Falk. Michael Hofmann. My question is related to the role of China in all of this. Because is it not that due to the fact that suddenly millions of workers were available in China, it was a chance for companies to shift a lot of production over there? And secondly, was it not, so to say, a side effect of it that trade unions became weaker and weaker, and people had a clear feeling that there's no countervailing power to these dynamic capitalists who are in this Google world or whatever you like to call them? And was it not that the multilateral institutions like the World Bank and IMF and others were only too enthusiastic about this development and were clearly indicating to people, well, look, an ideal world is the one where people shift around, where migration goes on and up and down, wherever you want. So if you want an ideal world for capitalism, and was it not that people were so afraid of it that they were rather open-minded for these kind of crazy people like Trump, Bolsonaro, and others?
You want to answer?
I'm not sure I want to, but it's a daunting series of questions that I can't do justice to. I do think the initial question about the degree to which this period of chaos and confusion gives rise to a populist search for a strong leader is something that is very much part of the picture. In other words, the psychopolitical conditions exist now where the public is less, or at least a large portion of the public is less interested in rational solutions and more interested in having a kind of emotional, grandiose picture painted by someone that purports to have the answers and purports to be able to solve the problems, usually at the expense of those who are vulnerable and weak. And so it's part of being a strong man is to identify the enemy as the weak, and to and it produces this cruel kind of politics. And in a way, this relates to this last question, if I understood it correctly, about the practice of capitalism being a rational outcome of its pure logic, and that China has played this game better than anyone else, and Trump, in that sense, is just a regressive response that is fighting a losing battle, in effect, trying to recover a form of economic life that is protectionist and isolated from global markets, and that just won't work in an integrated world economy of the sort that we have. And therefore, the answer to whatever is generated by the Chinese mastery of what I call soft power is not Trumpism, but some kind of more humane kind of capitalism. And how you achieve that is, of course, a very complex and difficult issue. The very interesting set of remarks about the importance of good relations with Russia, I share that sense, and I tried to express part of what you were saying by talking about the deep state. It's the deep state that has vetoed the impulses that Trump initially seemed to be pursuing, which involved good relations or improved relations with Russia, and offered a contrast with Hillary Clinton's seeming drift toward a new Cold War. And many expatriates, people living around outside the US, were more worried about that Clinton tendency toward confrontation and militarism than they were by Trump's bluster and social conservatism, that they actually voted for him because of this issue. And now I think you're right that whether you call the intelligence services of UK and the US or what I was calling the deep state has now made that Trump has sort of surrendered this agenda item as near as one can tell. I see you're not convinced that he's surrendered, but I don't see any recent evidence that he's tried to pursue a policy that looks toward good relations with Russia. Let me see if the question from Russia about the loss of the undermining of what I think you called hegemonic stability by the kind of hostility toward international institutions is, I think, a regressive feature of the Trump approach to world order. But one should say that this is not just Trump, and this is another part of what I should have said in my opening remarks, that many of the things that we are blaming Trump for were pre-Trump in their formation. And ever since really the end of the Cold War, the American leaders have been very unsupportive of international institutions and the UN in particular. And the policies have been driven partly by this sense that the UN is guilty of hostility to Israel, and that therefore it's good domestic politics in the US to attack the UN and blame the UN. And it's not given the sort of support that it would need to be an effective mechanism for protecting global interests. See, the real function of the UN in the 21st century, in my view, should be oriented around global interests and human interests, and let the governments pursue national interests. You need that interplay if we're ever to reach solutions to these global problems. As far as identity politics are concerned, I think they have played an important role in, as I tried to indicate in my remarks, they've operated as a substitute for a new progressive politics. And there's nothing wrong with trying to improve the conditions of women, of minorities, but what is wrong is to make that the core of the progressive movement. And what is missing is an alternative economics and a sense of how you bring, whether it's Keynesianism or some kind of responsibility for creating a more equitable distribution of the benefits of economic growth. Because what's happened in this period is a very unfair or inequitable distribution of the benefits of economic growth, leading people to feel as though they've been victimized by whoever's in power. And many sort of progressive people in the US will say, why bother voting? It doesn't really matter. See, and that attitude is the death of democracy, when people don't care about who is selected to lead the country. Now, with the advent of Trump, more people care because they see that things that are very immediate in their lives have suffered from the kind of policies he's pursued domestically.
Professor Falk, thank you very much for in-depth analysis. Raul Allerlof, Berlin International Governance Consulting. I was working 15 years for the UN and for the OSCE in crisis areas. Last year, I met directly after the election, or basically early spring, in China on a conference. A former American three-star ambassador asked him how we should deal with Mr. Trump. And he mentioned just, basically we have to overcome him and hope for the best. I think this is a little bit short-sighted. I think most of us here and also in the audience believe in multilateralism, and also from the Rhodes conference, and also believe that the problems we are dealing in the world with can be solved only multilateral and also with cooperation. We are going now in a slightly different direction, not only in America. So the question what you raised also after the midterm election, that the outcome leads in two ways, possibly, for the Democrats, either to be very cooperative and constructive or confrontational. So if you would be now the advisor or a leader of a think tank advising domestically the Democrats, and also maybe internationally, here we are in the European Union, how to bring forward our beliefs in the best way, programmatic way, that we will achieve in 2 or 5 years from now the results we would look forward to. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a very interesting and valuable set of reflections. I think that the Democrats have to first see how Trump plays his hand in this post-election period. Because if they adopt a confrontational approach without giving him the opportunity to seek a more compromising and constructive approach, it will alienate a lot of people, especially so-called independent voters, which is the largest voting bloc in the US. So I think, again, it's too early to frame a democratic strategy. If Trump is Trump, in other words, if Trump behaves the way he has in the past 2 years, then I think the Democrats have no choice but to try to show that they have a equal energy and resolve to project a different America. And they have an opportunity to do that if they can show that they are that they have policies and programs that really will help ordinary Americans, so-called Main Street America, as opposed to Wall Street America, the kind of polarity that sometimes is posed. So my sense is that the situation will become clearer within a month to 6 weeks. But at the moment, I'm hesitant. As far as Europe is concerned, I think Europe has a real opportunity in the Middle East and maybe more generally to show that they can act in a post-Cold War fashion, and that they don't have to accept this kind of subordinate relationship to the US at this stage, especially given the treatment they've received from Trump. And it will have an effect, I think, on the thinking in Washington. So far, they see a passive Europe, and therefore there's no cost to having basically insulted European approaches to world issues and seeming to privilege these autocratic leaders. I mean, that's, as I mentioned, these 4 countries that Trump isolated for praise in his UN speech, and Poland is the only European country, and it's the most, maybe it competes with Hungary for being the most right-wing government in Europe.
Question from the Moscow office, please.
Okay, go ahead.
The question from the Moscow. Hi, good evening, thank you. You mentioned that Donald Trump is quite for the journalism freedom, but at the same time, when the murder of the Saudi journalist took place, the only thing that Mr. Trump said was that they covered up their tracks, should cover up their tracks better. And we all know that Saudi Arabia is the close partner, economic partner for the USA, and there will be no probably sanctions for this murder. And do you think that it is real to build a global world and to build close relationships in the situation of such a global double standard? And what do you think about this situation? What Mr. Trump should do or should say about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Argentina? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. In Buenos Aires, we will be holding in a couple of weeks the G20 meeting. They will let us know what kind of Trump we should expect in that meeting. A Trump respecting multilateralism, a Trump that will like to blow up all the G20. What kind of Trump we should be expected?
Okay, short answers.
I don't know.
That's very short.
Yes, that's right. I do think the Khashoggi murder, which is such a gruesome act that can't really be separated from the leadership of Saudi Arabia, if it's ignored, it passes a very bad, it creates a very bad precedent that even a horrible crime like this, there's no accountability for. And you think back to the efforts in World War II, the end of World War II, to set up some kind of framework of international criminal accountability. It was not very appropriately applied because it only applied to the losers in the Second World War. But it made a promise to the future that those that sat in judgment could only vindicate what happened at the Nuremberg trials if they applied the same principles to their own behavior in the future. And in that sense, the Nuremberg promise has been broken, and the reaction to the Khashoggi murder is a very dramatic example of the degree to which arms sales are more important than some elementary form of accountability that one imposes on leaders for acting below any standard. You can't even call it barbaric. It's worse than that. And so to do nothing but to go on with the alliance relationship with Saudi Arabia will be a very demoralizing will have a very demoralizing effect, I think.
Yeah, but Trump is not alone in this business. Hmm?
No.
If you look, for example, as a beacon of democratic spirits nowadays in France, and the shipment of arms to Saudi Arabia, we see, of course, not a parallel in quality and in style, but in essence, yes. And what I found quite interesting is since 2009, the NIC, the National Intelligence Council, is producing 1 month after the inauguration of the President of the United States a kind of a report, how the world will look like in 25, 35, and so forth. Even the CIA is doing this. And it's quite interesting that since 2009, it was absolutely clear among the think tanks of the United States and nowadays even of the think tanks in Anglo-Saxon and other countries, Europe and Japan and so forth, the United States will not be able anymore to play the role of a global policeman. In multipolarity as a concept for the New World Order was first mentioned in 2009 in this report of the NRC. This is an authoritative report which basically does not give recommendations how to act, but which sketches the framework within a president should act. And I think maybe from Obama, Trump was the first one who realized the essence of these reports in staying away from not using anymore the means of military intervention, but of economic fiscal interventions, which is a kind of a play of soft power. Obama did this too after Libya, and I think in this regard, we are maybe a little bit can shed off our anxieties and fears of a kind of a political and military rivalry between the superpowers which are driving the international scenery at the moment. Richard, thank you very much for your patience, for coming here, talking to us, and I think you delivered a lot food for thought, and I hope that we see you soon somewhere else, and either here or on roads or wherever. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.